Before we start this video, a large thank you to Omar, Ravid, Videopop, Raphael, and Nuxelin for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. And an immense thank you to Halo Burner for their continued support of the channel this month on Patreon. It is greatly appreciated, my friend, and I hope you enjoy the video. Hello everybody, and today we're going to finish up our equipment. So by the end of this video, you'll be able to equip and unequip all of your items across your weapon slots and your armor slots. So over here on the player UI equipment manager script, I'm going to make a new void for a select equipment slot. I'm going to make it require an int. I'm going to call that equipment slot. So we're going to use this to basically take in a number, and depending on that number, we're going to assign that equipment slot a selection from the enum. We do this by saying current equipment slot is equal to the equipment slot that we're passing, like so. But we have to cast that basically as this enum. So you might be asking, why don't we just pass the enum instead? Well, we're going to use this in a UI event, and it won't let you use it if it's not a basic variable type, to my knowledge anyway. So let's go over here to the right hand weapon equipment slot. You can see here if I add an event trigger, and I'm going to add select, I'm going to hit this plus icon, drag in the equipment manager game object, and there you will see select equipment slot, and we pass the int. So this one's going to be 0. Also, apologies for the noise in the background. I'm out of my office and my dogs are around me, so you might hear some tapping and stuff. So if we go over to the enums, you can see the enum type. This will be 0, this will be 1, this will be 2, etc., etc. And you can also manually assign these their own integer values too. But if they're left alone, it will go up from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. So pretty simple. So we go back to the right weapon, it's 0. And then the right weapon on 1, we can copy this component, by the way, and just paste this component on all of these to make this a little bit faster. And then we scroll down through them and add the numbers in. So it's going, whoops, forgot these two. Do these two real fast. It's going to be 0 for right hand 1, and then 1 for right hand 2, and then 2 for right hand 3. You can see I have the numbers 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, and then 3, 4, and 5 for the left weapons. And then if you add your equipment for your armor, if you did head, body, legs, and hands in that order, it will be 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, yada, yada, yada. And it will go on indefinitely, depending on how many slots you have. So let's add a public void unequip selected item. So let's make a switch statement, and we're going to pass our current selected equipment slot. Now, we'll do this for weapons, and then we'll jump into armor and do both equipping and unequipping. So let's make an item variable here, and we're going to call this unequipped item. And we're going to say this is equal to the player UI manager.instance. Whoops, wrong game. This is not Nephilim. I have to reference my player via the network. So we're going to make a player manager variable up here called player. We're going to get the local player by doing a network trick. We're going to do that by saying equals network manager.singleton.localclient.playerObject.getComponent player manager. Cool. All right, now that we got that, we can reference that by saying player.playerInventory.manager.weapons in right hand slots, and it's going to be 0 because this is the first weapon. Excellent. Now when we have that, right below that, we know that the weapon is never going to be null because it is going to be unarmed if you set it up right. But just in case, we can check for null if you want to just be totally safe, but this should always be at least unarmed. We're going to say player.playerInventoryManager.weapons in right hand slots 0 is equal to, and we're going to say instantiate world item database dot instance, and we're going to instantiate a copy of our unarmed weapon. So basically, we're taking this unequipped weapon first. If it exists, we're just banking that as a local variable. And then we're changing the weapon right hand slots 1 to the unarmed weapon because we're unequipping it. And then we're going to take our unequipped weapon, and we're going to say if unequippedweapon.id does not equal world item database instance.unarmed weapon ID, we're going to add that to our inventory. You don't ever want to add the unarmed weapon to our inventory, ever. I mean, maybe for some weird reason you would in your game, but the way we're setting up like Elden Ring, you would never want to do that. So that's it. We can copy then paste this. Whoops, actually we're getting one more thing. We're going to say if the player, I just did it again, this is not Nephilim. If the player.playerInventoryManager.right hand weapon index is equal to 0, so if you're holding the weapon you've just unequipped, we also want to basically refresh our weapon. So we want to set our network variable. That's how we do it in this project by saying player.playerNetworkManager.current right hand weapon ID.value is equal to, and then we're going to pass the newly unequipped weapon, which is our unarmed, and we pass the item ID. All right, cool. So now it will be the exact same thing for all of these, except you're just changing the numbers from, say, 0 to 1. And we also can simplify this right here like this. So we just take one less line of code. You do the same thing for right weapon 1, 2, 3, and then your left weapon 1, 2, 3. But before we do that, let's jump back into here. Let's actually get this working for one weapon and test it out. So let's go to the menu game object. This is important. Let's make a new script called Player UI Equipment Manager Input Manager. So why am I making this an input manager, and why am I putting it here on this menu object? Well, the menu object is only active sometimes, and we're going to be using an update method to actually check for these inputs. And to keep it clean and to keep every UI having its own input selection, we're just going to give it its own so it's not kind of gunking up the works in the regular input manager. Because again, it's not going to be heavy as a cost because this only runs when the menu's up. So we're only running the update function when this is enabled. So it disables itself, just turning off all the unused inputs we don't require to check for. So it's just better for saving some memory and etc. Now, I'm going to make a player controls variable. By the way, we're setting this up just like we did the player manager inputs all that time ago. So then I'm going to make a player UI equipment variable, and I'm going to make an inputs header and have an input variable for Unequip item input. Okay, what's next? We don't need very much here. We're going to set it up, like I said, exactly like we do the player input manager. But before we do that, let's make an awake function and get the variable for player UI equipment manager by referencing get component in parent. Because again, this sits one game object below the parent object that contains the player UI equipment manager. Next, we're going to use onEnable, and this is how we set up our inputs. We're going to say if player controls equals null, player controls is equal to, and we're just going to basically make a new one by saying new player controls. And then we're going to set up all the interactions with our inputs. We only have one though, so we're going to say player controls.player actions. I'm going to use X. So let's go make that, because I actually don't think we've done that yet because we don't have any items we can use in game. So this is going to share the same input for me as we're going to use later on when we do like using an item in your consumable slots. So you could call it use item if you want, or you call it X, or if you're on a PlayStation controller or whatever other controller, you call it something else. You call it Unequip item if you want to make its own button. But like I said, I'm going to share my button across two, so I'm just going to use X, much like RB and LB. So now my button is going to be the West button on the gamepad. That on an Xbox One controller is X. I believe it's square on a PlayStation controller. Gonna close it out and save it, and then I'm gonna go back here and say player controls dot player actions dot X, and then the same syntax as before, dot performed plus equals. Then we're gonna say I equals greater than unequipped item input is equal to true. So when you press that button, it changes this input to true, and then on disable we want to say player controls dot disable. Now we want to call upon our update function. There we go. And now we're going to call upon a function that doesn't exist, and we're going to make it. So I'm going to call the function handle player UI equipment manager inputs. That's very descriptive, and it's pretty clear what that does. Now I'm going to make a private void, and I'm going to paste the name here and just fill in this function. So what do we want to do? It's the same thing to do with all of our inputs. We're going to check if the input has been pressed. If it has, immediately disable it so we don't run this logic more than once. And then we're going to say player UI equipment manager dot unequip selected item. Okay, let's save that. Oh, and I did forget one thing. I'm going to come down below here on the onEnable and say player controls dot enable. It's very important, otherwise it will not read any of your inputs. There we go. Now let's jump back over to the player UI equipment manager, and let's call open equipment manager at the end of this. We refresh it. So refreshes the equipment manager. And just to make this very clear too, I'm actually going to make a function in this video that will be called when you're refreshing it, as opposed to just opening it again, in case you want to add any other logic. Now we go into the game here and I press X over my spear. You can see it unequips. Cool. And the icon updates, and there it is back in inventory, and I can re-equip it again. All right, that's working as intended. So let's keep moving on and add the logic now for other things. All right, so I'm going to close this menu, and I'm going to go back to our script here, our UI equipment script. So you can see here I have a bunch of empty weapons that I haven't done. So we can only equip the right hand weapon 1 right now. We can only unequip the right hand weapon 1. So let's change that so we can do all the weapons. Now I'm only going to show you one real quick. I'm going to make this variable a variable up top here instead of a local variable within the switch. And I'm just going to remove this. So now we can just kind of keep using this local variable for each slot. I'm going to copy the whole contents of right weapon 1. Again, this is on the UI equipment inventory slot. And I'm just going to go down and change 0 to 1, 0 to 1. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the left-hand weapons, except I'm going to change right to left and then put in the appropriate numbers. All right, so here it is with everything done. You can copy this if you want, but again, you can do this. I'm sure this is very, very simple, and I'm sure a lot of you already have this done from the last video. All right, now under the unequipment, same thing. Pause the video right now and do it yourself. Totally do it yourself. I'm just going to do one for an example. I'm going to copy all of the right-hand weapon 1 stuff. Again, we're going to make this variable a local variable because you can see it's going to complain if I don't. So, or rather, we're going to put a variable up here and take it outside of the switch statement as a local variable. And I'm just going to erase item like this. And then depending on the slot, we're going to set this variable. And again, we're going to change 0 to 1 because this is right-hand weapon slot 2 as opposed to 1. And we're referencing this next slot here in the selection of weapons and the index. And then do the same thing for the left-hand weapon. And by the end, it should look like this. So there's left-hand weapon 3, 2, and 1. And there's right-hand weapon 3, 2, and 1. All right, cool. Let's save that. And now if I were to go back over to my Open Equipment Manager, my Player UI Equipment Manager script, I'm going to make a new public void for refresh menu. We're going to start using this instead of Open Equipment Manager. And all we're going to do is copy these last two little functions here and paste those in there. So if you want to add any other logic when you refresh it, this is what we're going to do in the future. So let's find every spot we reference this, and let's change it in a bunch of these. Pretty much all of them, I think, actually, because we open it from a button in the UI. So everywhere else here, we have comments and stuff. Let's just replace this with refresh menu. It's not super important, but I'm going to do it because I like having the different functions to just basically operate on different terms. We don't want to have to open the menu every time we want to refresh some stuff. And plus, there might be some things we want to do when we refresh the menu that we wouldn't do otherwise when we open it. So just in case, I'm going to put these everywhere here now. It's pretty simple where they are. Okay, I think there's 8 total, and this is the last one. All right, cool. Now that that is done, I'm going to save this again. And I'm going to make another function here. This function is going to be called a public void named select last selected equipment slot. So what does this do? Well, after you equip an item in your UI equipment inventory, this function simply returns you to the last selected button when you're finished equipping a new item. So for example, if I click the head equipment and then it loads up your inventory full of head equipment, when I'm done equipping one, it brings you back to the head equipment button. Or that's what it's going to do when it's complete. So under equip item, let's call upon player UI instance.player UI equipment manager.select last selected equipment slot. And let's save that. Now, how do we get these? This is very simple. You can see we have a bunch of images for all of our slots. We can actually get the button by doing a switch statement. And what we're going to do now is we're going to do the switch statement on current selected equipment slot, because remember, this is going to be updated with our events when we hover over the button on select. And then we're going to make a local variable for button last selected button is equal to null at first. And then we're going to get this button by, if we're under the right-hand weapon slot 1, all we need to do is reference the right-hand weapon slot 1's image icon. So we're going to say last selected button is equal right-hand slot 01.get component in parent button. Because the image icon sits below a button component on the hierarchy, it's a child object. So do the same thing with right-hand slot 2 and 3 and left-hand slot 1, 2, and 3. Then we're going to say if last selected button is not equal null, last button.select, and then last selected button.onSelect null. All right, let's save that, and that should work as intended now. So if I go back into the game here, I'm going to open up the equipment window. I'm going to go unequip my spear, all my weapons actually. I'll first equip a sword. Yep, works. And then equip a spear in the offhand, or the next slot, and then a sword, and then a spear. And that is working as intended. And if I were to switch these weapons now, they would cycle through. As you can see, here's a spear, and here's the other spear. Cool, awesome. Okay, so what's next? Let's go and do our equipment for our armor now. So let's go to the Player UI Manager prefab. And I'm just going to duplicate one of these here. Let's duplicate the right-hand weapons, and I'm going to drag that below so it's kind of next in the layout group after the weapons. I'm going to call this armor slots. And we actually just use the same prefab. It's going to be pretty much identical. We just change a number because of the way we have it set up. They're all going to work pretty much the same. So I am going to call this, you can call it helmet or head equipment or whatever you want, but it's just going to be the first slot we do. Let's just do the head equipment first and make sure it works, and then we'll do the rest. So let's go to enums now, and let's add, you can see our last one we have is 5. Let's add one for the helmet. Let's add one for the body. Let's add one for the leg. Actually, now that I'm saying this out loud, let's change this from helmets to head, because it could be a hood, it could be anything. So we got head, body, legs, and then hands. And that's going to be 6, 7, 8, and 9. So you can just make a comment here if you want. You don't need to do this, but just in case you want to, I'm just going to do it because I've already done it with the rest to make my point earlier. So I might as well finish it. So we got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Let's save that. Let's jump back over to the Player UI Manager prefab. Change this to 6 because it's the head slot. And let's duplicate that 3 more times to make a body slot. Change the body slot to 7, and then we got a leg slot, change the leg slot to 8, and then we have a hand slot, change the hand slot to 9. All right, cool. That's good. It's pretty much all we need to do with these right now. I am going to put some spacing here and say 25 between it so the slots are a bit more spaced out. And I am going to save this prefab. Oh, and I'm going to untick the menu first. There we go, save. All right, let's go over to the UI equipment inventory slot under equip item. So you can see here we have a weapon item variable. Let's just change this to an item variable. Let's call that, instead of current weapon, let's just call this, what are we going to call it? Equipped item. Okay, so you can see here we have all of our weapons done, and it doesn't change anything by changing that to a weapon because we already casted it in the last video anyway as a weapon item. So what we're going to do is copy from left weapon 03 and paste another component here in the switch statement. I'm going to change this to head, and then I'm going to change this from equip weapon is equal to player.player inventory manager head equipment. And then we're going to say if the equipment does not equal null, instead of the item ID we're checking here. So you can see here we have an item ID. We're going to say if equipment does not equal null, then we're going to add it to our inventory. Right here, then we're supposed to replace that slot with our new weapon. So we're going to say player.player inventory manager head equipment is equal to current item as head equipment item. And then we're going to remove the item from inventory, which we're already doing. Yes, that is the same. And then down here, we want to update our head equipment so it loads in the network. So we need to re-equip it by saying player.player equipment manager, and I believe we called it load head equipment. And then we're going to pass, you could pass the current item and then cast it as a head equipment item, but you can see we've already assigned it to our inventory. So instead, we're just going to pass our player.player inventory head equipment item. Okay, cool. And that is it. Now you can do the same thing for the other armor pieces now. I'm going to change these comments too so it fits this new functionality. But you can do the same thing right now if you feel like it for all of the other armor pieces, body, legs, and then your hands. I'm going to do that momentarily, but first I am going to make sure that both equipping and unequipping for the helmet slot is working before I paste the logic. That way if we have to fix something, we don't have to fix it across 3 or 4 or more functions. Okay, so let's go over to the player UI equipment manager. What we're going to do now is come down to where we unequip stuff, and I'm just going to copy this segment here like I did with the previous one where we equip it. I'm going to replace left weapon 03 with head, and now we're going to go down through it and change it. So unequipped item is equal to the head equipment. If the unequipped item does not equal null, what are we going to do? Well, we're not going to assign it an unarmed weapon. We don't need to do that. So let's just come in here and take a look at what we can do. Well, what we want to do after we set our unequipped item, right below that, we're going to say if unequipped item does not equal null, then we're going to come down here and basically add it to our inventory. And that's it. Now, right below that, we need to also set the current head equipment as null. So we need to make sure there's nothing there anymore after we add it to our inventory. And then, of course, we need to refresh our head equipment on the network. So first we say player.player inventory manager.head equipment is equal to null. And then we say player.player equipment manager.load head equipment. And you can pass either null here, or you can pass the player head equipment variable from the inventory because both are null. It doesn't really matter. Just to keep things consistent, I am going to go ahead and pass the actual head equipment from the player inventory like so. All right, cool. And now we can save that. So if you wanted to now, you can do the same thing again for all other equipment pieces. But before we do that, I'm going to add some more stuff here. So right now we have refresh weapon slot icons. You could make a refresh armor equipment slot icons, whatever. I'm just going to rename this to refresh equipment slot icons. That will encompass all of our equipment. And then I'm going to add into this the functionality to support all of our armor equipment. So right now it goes right up from right weapon 1, 2, and 3 and left weapon 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to do the same thing here, but add in the support for head equipment slot, body equipment slot, leg, and hand. So head equipment, we're going to start by making a head equipment variable called head equipment. We're going to initialize that at the player.player inventory manager.head equipment. And then from there, we can just copy everything really from the weapons. It's pretty much identical except for one tiny detail. And we're going to do this with a variable right now that does not exist. So I am just going to basically make that variable. You can see we have the right hand weapon slot 1, 2, and 3 and left hand weapon slot 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to make new images for the head equipment slot, and then I'm going to do the same for the body equipment slot, and then the leg equipment slot, and then the hand equipment slot. So we have the head, body, legs, and hand equipment slot images. There we go. Last one. Save. All right, let's go back down to our function. And we're going to say hand equipment or head equipment slot enabled is equal to true. Do the same thing down here. And then we're good to go. Now we can copy this and do the same thing. I've done it here for my hand. You can see leg, body, and head. I'm going to save that. Now let's drag in these image variables here under the proper place. Like I said, you could rename this from item icon to head equipment item icon, body equipment item icon, leg equipment item icon if you want to. That way if they ever become unlinked, it's easy just to search them in the inspector and relink them. But I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to name this from helmet to head. And I forgot one thing. We're not checking if the item icon is null for these. We're checking if the item itself is null. Because unlike the weapons, which should never be null because they always default to unarmed, the armor equipment can be null. So don't check if the icon is null. Check if the item itself is null. Otherwise, you will get an error most likely. I'm going to save that. I'm going to go back into the project here. You can see I don't have any item icons for my armor. So I'm just going to quickly steal some from Nephilim. These don't exactly match the armor, but I'm just doing this to get the point across. I'll make some for this project eventually. But for now, just to make sure this works, I'm just going to grab these ones I've snatched from Nephilim and use those. Now, let's go over into, you can see here if I go, whoops, wrong slot. If I go to the right weapon slot, we have our on, select on enable. When I duplicated that, I accidentally gave that to all 4 of these equipment armor slots, so we'll remove that. We only want that on the first right-hand weapon slot. Otherwise, it will just select the last one that uses that script, which is probably going to be your hand equipment. Now, over on load equipment inventory, you can see here we have an inventory loaded for all of our weapons, but we don't have an inventory loaded for any of our equipment that is in our armor. So let's just copy that and do the same for everything, head, body, leg, and hands, or legs and hands. And let's actually make functionality for all these individually. So it's going to be, again, identical to how we do our weapons, except instead of doing it with our weapon, we're going to search for specific armor equipment. So head equipment, body equipment, leg equipment, or hand equipment. Now I'm going to make these functions that don't exist, or rather call upon them right here. So head will be load head equipment inventory, and then body will be load body equipment inventory, legs and hands, etc., etc. And after I do that, I am going to make these functions using the same names I gave up here or called upon. So right below load weapon inventory, you can see I have head, body, leg, and hands, and they're all empty. So let's go ahead now and copy all of the logic in load weapon inventory. I think there's only 4 things we have to change here. It's very subtle. It's going to work identically the same. 5 things optionally. So instead of loading a list of weapon items, we're going to load a list of equipment items. And you could just rename this to equipment and inventory so you can reuse the same name every time. But I'm going to give it each its own name. So this will be head equipment in inventory, and then I'll use body, leg, and hand, etc. But like I said, if you want to keep it general, just say equipment in inventory. And then just change all of the variables that mention weapon to head equipment. That's it. And if you want to also change this, you can change it to equipment, or you can change it to head equipment. I'll just call it equipment so we can reuse it for the next 4, or 3 rather. So that's it. The only 4 things you have to change. 5 optionally if you want to change the name of the list, and everything else works exactly the same. So I'm going to paste this now and do the same thing as I've done here with leg, body, and hand. You can see there it is. You want to take a look. So we're changing the list type and the variable type. That's it. All right, now over on select last selected equipment slot, let's do the same thing now that we have those equipment icons for our armor. And let's just make sure we're selecting the last equipment slot properly if we're on the head slot, the body slot, the leg slot, or the hand slot. So again, it's the same thing. You just reference the slot and get the component button in parent. And that's it. You save it. Okay, cool. Let's go into the scene here now and test this out. If I go to the equipment window, if I unequip my helmet, there's that terrifying face. And if I re-equip it, we cover it back up, which it looks a lot better. All right, and you can just unequip it and re-equip it as much as you want, and it will select the last slot used. Cool. So what's next? So we have our head done for the UI equipment inventory, and we have our head done for unequipping it. So we have it for equipping it and unequipping it. We don't have it for the rest of the armor slots. So right now, pause the video, and in these 2 scripts, make the functionality for equipping and unequipping it. All right, do that now. Okay, cool. So now here we are. We're back. I'm going to go over to the UI equipment inventory slot, and I'm going to copy the head equipment right to the breakpoint, paste it, and then I'm going to change head to body. And all we're doing is looking for wherever it says head and changing it to body. And that's pretty much it. Instead of loading our head equipment then, we're loading our body equipment, etc., etc. Instead of casting as a head equipment variable, we're casting as a body equipment variable. And that is it. So now I'm going to quickly do the other two off video and snap back and show you. And you can pause it if you want to copy it if you're still confused. But if you are confused, I encourage you to rewatch this because we're just going to write the same logic again for the other two, and here they are. All right, cool. So now over on the Unequip section of things, so over on the Player UI Equipment Manager, I'm going to copy the head again and paste it right to the breakpoint, change head to body, and do the exact same thing. We're just looking for wherever it says head, and we're replacing it with body. So load head equipment becomes load body equipment, and player.player inventory manager head equipment becomes player.player inventory manager body equipment, just like that. Now I will paste the same for the hands and the legs. You can see here, I've done this off video. Here they are, looking exactly the same, but replacing the keywords. Let's save that, go into the game here now, and if I go to equip window, I can unequip all of my items, and there is a terrifying man with a terrifying face. And then I can re-equip all of my stuff if I so choose. You can equip and unequip things individually, and you can see the inventory refreshes. There you go, guys. That should definitely help it feel a lot more like a game now, because you can have lootable items, you can find stuff, you can create some monsters, some drop tables, and then switch out your weapons and equipment accordingly. So, thank you all very much for joining me again this weekend. I hope you all learned something, and I hope you all enjoyed the video. I want to give a shout out, as always, to my patrons. It is genuinely because of each and every one of you I get to keep doing this, so you have my sincerest gratitude. I hope you all have a very lovely weekend. I will see you guys next week, where we're going to get into our stance/posture breaking system. If you don't know what it is, if you hit an enemy enough times, you'll break their posture, and then you can perform a critical attack, which is the same as the riposte attack in Souls games.